Chapter 3 is a transitional chapter because it displays a story example of what will come on and explain the rest of the chapters of Leading with a Limp. So we look at Chapter 3 and we see Allender, he starts Chapter 3 with the words that point to the main focus. A leader leads by the stories he tells or she tells and the myths that he or she creates on behalf of his or her people. And in this story that he talks about, there's an echo to a bigger story which you'll probably already figured out if you read it, and if you haven't, you'll soon figure it out. I'm just going to read a portion of this chapter so that we get a context of what Allender later relates to as the 5 challenges of leadership. The Isaacson construction company, Johann Isaacson, created the second largest construction firm in the world. His company designed and constructed huge dams, road systems in several countries, and 3 of the world's 10 tallest buildings at that time. A conglomerate, Isaacson Construction Company, handled all facets of its projects, financing, designing, building, and managing both the site and all aspects of the construction process. Johann announced on his 72nd birthday that he intended to pass the mantle to a new CEO before he turned 75. He had several sons, many grandsons, but all the youngest grandsons were possible successors, but the oldest son, Herman, was the heir apparent. He'd worked his way up from entry level to senior management. He'd successfully managed several of the company's largest projects. He was aggressive, street smart, and resilient. His father favored him and turned to him for both wisdom and companionship. The second son, Jake, was a computer whiz with an undergraduate degree from MIT and an MBA from Harvard. Brilliant and resourceful, he functioned as his brother's constant and fierce competitor. Herman, if named the company's next CEO, would naturally take the company forward in the same trajectory as his father had done. If Jake, however, were handed the reins, he would divest the company of certain subsidiaries and steer it toward being a shrewder player in international markets. Jake had the backing of his mother. The most complex and powerful player in this transition of corporate and family power was Johann's wife, Becky Isaacson. She did not have an official position, but her ability to influence decisions was widely acknowledged. Those who wanted Johann's business knew that they must court Becky. She openly criticized her older son Herman because he'd married a woman whom Becky considered unsophisticated. Furthermore, Becky saw in Herman a proclivity to impulsive behavior, and she feared that ICC would be eventually buried under his lack of foresight and patience. She knew that Jake, with his shrewdness and technological savvy, would take the company to realms that neither Herman nor Johann could ever dream of. Jake could credit his mother for much of his success. Becky had steered him to technology and had helped him own his skill for making the best steel possible. She trained him at an early age to bargain with store clerks, and he perfected the art of getting a better deal even on the items marked with a fixed price. As he grew older, he learned how to arrange discounted financing that no one else could obtain. In many ways, it's Becky's machinations that are the pivot point in this case study. At 73, Johann had a stroke and the company splintered as the 2 factions scrambled to claim and control territory. Most of the analysts who've drawn conclusions based on studies of ICC follow the interplay of the sons and the failure to set up a succession plan. But again, Becky was the real player in the eventual dismantling of the corporation after health issues forced Johann to step down. Brief but interesting story that you may hear echoes already of another story. Actually, the story from Genesis 25 and on, where you see the story of the person who's the main point of the book, and also one of the people who point us to how to be a leader, which was Jacob. Becky being veiled as Rebecca, Herman veiled as Esau, and Isaac being the father of the company. Details added in for creative license. You notice that there's betrayal and narcissism in the company story. You can see how it basically moves within with 2 players of each parts of the family fighting with each other. Same thing, Jacob and his mother, Isaac and Esau, and you see how that plays out in Genesis 25 and on. You see how each person as they go along, and especially if you're focusing on Jacob, as there's more information about him, that little by little his way of looking and working in the world, and as we frame it in leadership, and as Allender talks about his leadership, you see that he is akin to betrayal. He's a person who falls into narcissism, looking into himself, wanting his own way, letting things happen that really with an ethical standard and with basis of the faith of Yahweh that he had at least been known of from Abraham to Isaac to that family, you see that he's stepping away from that. Narcissism is not merely an orientation to life that's self-centered. It's way more debilitating. It empties a person's inner core as you become manipulative and suspicious. Allender points that out. And there's a wound that tends to go with it, and you tend to hide that wound. This type of leader regards even minor criticisms as disloyalty. Years earlier, Becky had left her powerful family and fallen in love with Johann, according to this apocryphal story. But he'd betrayed her, leaving behind a deep emptiness that Becky addressed by allying herself with Jake, the younger son who'd failed to earn Johann's favor. The unresolved marital issues led to division within the family and the fracturing of the corporation. Betrayal, narcissism, also crisis and cowardice had been brewing for a long time. We see the crisis as has been displayed in the cowardice with how it's been responded to, the vicious cycle that occurs, the growing emptiness in the leadership that you see throughout the story. And also you see complexity and rigidity as a challenge to leadership. The deception is elegant and even simple and very, very cunning. And yet, as he's learning to navigate the world in that way, he's going further and further away from the type of leadership that we can see that God eventually wants to bring him to, as he teaches him how to limp as a leader. The last two challenges are loneliness and hiding. As we talked about that before, we can again see those two things displayed in the various characters of the biblical narrative and also this Allender narrative. And then lastly, weariness and fatalism. There's so much intensity, there's so much that goes on as leaders that it's very easy to get weary, and they make mistakes that cause trouble. And if they're public, they really change how people view you. If you look at the show Scandals and the way that the public perceives presidential candidates, the president, the people behind the scenes, it's very, very complicated, challenging, and very, very difficult. We can draw some different confusions from this. As you've noticed, it's Genesis 25 that goes right to chapter 35. The climax of the story is actually chapter 32, where Jacob wrestles with God, and he gains a new name as well as a leader's limp. God touches the socket of his hip, and now he can no longer walk the same. And this is the picture throughout the book that we get about leadership, that leading has the limping quality through the Jacob example, and that when we limp as leaders, we are remembering our dependency, that we are not in charge of our lives. Jacob's later shown to be deceived by his own family. The story with Laban is the joke's on him, and then eventually he's in this life and death struggle with this person that he meets by the Jabbok River, and they fight all night, and eventually he wants his name, and the person won't give him his name, the person he's fighting with. And as Jacob finally comes out of the battle, he realizes he's struggled with God, and his name actually is changed to Israel, to struggle with God. The process of becoming a person, Allender says, who can lead others with a limp is not what we would have predicted. He brings this out of the Jacob story, and then he unfolds it in the chapters that follow. Do we really have to be that desperate and that deeply exposed to be freed from our narcissism, our fear, our dogmatism, and our tendency to hide? The story of Jacob exalts not the struggle, but the goodness of God as he blesses a conniving, undeserving man. No matter how far off the mark we might be, we see in this account the promise that if we open ourselves to meet God, we will not come out of the encounter the same. We will walk a new path with an unpredictable gait. I ask that you ponder a little bit this story, if you have the book you're reading along with us, or that you just think about the biblical story and reflect upon it. And then as we are ready the next time, we will look at chapter 4, a chapter that talks about failing that matters. And we'll continue with our journey through this book, Leading with a Limp. Thanks for following along with us.